Everybody could take their seat. We're going to start up. It's my distinct honor to welcome Dr. Pat Friman. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the introduction, other to say that Pat Friman is a scholar, well-published. He has given many talks across the nation on topics related to both behavior analysis and autism. He is a frequent friend of this conference. We've had him here several years. And most importantly, he's a skilled practitioner and has worked with many families and children through his efforts at Boys Town. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our friend Pat Friman.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Pat Friman. Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. The title of my presentation is EIBI, ASD, and the Forward March of Behavior Analysis. And I want to talk a little bit about inclusion and exclusion, because that's not a very inclusive title. I know some of you are behavior analysts, but not all of you are behavior analysts, and that title suggests that this talk is for behavior analysts, and it's not. It's for everybody, and I hope to make that clear as I go along here. I want to continue on talking about inclusion and exclusion. Everybody in this room lives with, works with, or for persons on the spectrum. Everybody in this room lives with, works with, or for persons on the spectrum. Can you still hear me in the back? Yes, no? What language is that in? How about this? All right. Where was I? Everybody in this room lives with or works with or for persons on the spectrum except for one person. Everybody in this room lives with, works with, or for persons on the spectrum except for one person. That person is me. And so why would they select somebody who doesn't live with, work with, or for persons on the spectrum to do a keynote address for an autism conference? They were drunk. That's why. They were intoxicated. They lost their senses. Actually, I hope to make their decision look like the right one as I go along here. I'm committed to doing that. I'm nervous about it. It doesn't help that I read an article on stage fright last night, which is very much in my mind right now. An article in the New Yorker. I probably shouldn't have read it. In any event, that's my commitment, is to make it apparent that it was a good choice. And let me continue on with inclusion and exclusion, because there's another group of people in the room that I'm not part of, and that is parents or people that are going to be parents. That's probably just about everybody. And I'm a child and family psychologist. And I don't have a child or a family. Because I don't want to mess up my theories with facts. And I don't like to touch poop. And the distinction between spit up, which children do a lot of, and puke, which we do, is not that clear to me. And I don't want to get either substance on my body. And I'm allergic to Velcro, and so that pretty much disqualifies me as ever becoming a parent. In addition, I see the bargain that you've made. I see how this deal goes down, and I'm not willing to make it. You have a child, and you set aside your priorities and make the child your priority. And when the child is hungry, you feed the child. When the child's upset, you comfort the child. And when the child's scared, you reassure the child. And you lose sleep so the child can get sleep, and you set aside your ideas of how to have fun, and you devote yourself to how the child wants to have fun, and all the time you used to have now goes to that child. And what do you get for all these efforts? What is your reward for these sacrifices? Well, you get an angry teenager that thinks you're stupid, unfair, and hypocritical. It's like God saying, I told you folks that sex wasn't supposed to be about fun. You didn't listen, this is what you get teenagers. So I'm not willing to make that bargain. I'm not willing to make that deal. I make light of this. I'm making jokes about this, but It's not funny, actually. I know what I missed. And those of you that are parents, you know what I missed. And you know I'm not going to have it. I know I'm not going to have it ever. This is not going to happen in my life. And I would be so good at it now. I would be such a good father now. I'm the right guy, but I'm the wrong age. It just isn't going to happen. And when I was the right age, I was the wrong guy. And I had good sense to know that. So, does this make me sad from time to time? Yes, it does. Does it make me abidingly unhappy? No, it doesn't. And why? Well, the reason why, or the answer to the question why, is that I get to get in on the deal. I'm not in the game, but I'm down on the playing field. I'm assisting. I'm helping out parents, and I'm helping out people that help out parents. That's a big part of what I'm doing right now. So I get a piece of the action, and that's enough to sustain me. It rewards me. I appreciate it. I like it. It enlivens me. And it's, like I say, part of what I'm doing right now. So I mentioned I don't specialize in persons on the spectrum or autism. I don't specialize in any populations, and I don't specialize in any problems. That doesn't mean I don't have expert level knowledge about some populations. I do, and I have expert level knowledge about some problems, but I don't specialize in populations or problems. I specialize in people. That's my specialty. I work with whoever comes in the door. And I've got clients that are younger than 6 months of age. You might wonder, what kind of psychological behavior problems could a child younger than 6 months of age have? And I'll tell you that, number one, they won't do as they're told. And number two, they don't pee in the potty. So there's a lot of work to be done there. I have clients that are in their 80s. I'll tell you something about them. A lot of them, they won't do as they're told. And a lot of them don't pee in the potty, so there's work to be done there. And there's a whole bunch of work to do in the middle. So how is it possible to specialize that broadly? What kind of arrogance does that take? And I say it doesn't take arrogance. The reason I can specialize so broadly is because of an incredibly powerful idea. The idea that behavior is a function of its circumstances, past and present. And it is the idea that is underneath EIBI. It is the foundational principle for behavior analysis, and it is the foundational principle for all effective treatments that have been used for persons on the spectrum. It is an idea that is relevant for all behavior and all persons, and that's why I can specialize so broadly. The thing about this idea, though, is it's a relatively new idea. It's only been around for about 100 years in any significant way. And it's in competition with some very old ideas that have been around for thousands of years. This new idea is very hard to use. It's not very popular. It's not very well understood. It's not very widely applied. It's not even very widely liked. And those old ideas are used by everybody all the time. Even behavior analysts that are very familiar with the idea don't use it very much. Even behavior analysts that are very familiar with the idea don't use it very much. They use it in their work readily, but they don't necessarily use it in their personal lives, and they have much more personal life than they do work life. For example, they have a child that has a tantrum, and they might apply the idea to that tantrum thinking the reason that tantrum is occurring is because there's an extinction procedure going on, and then a colleague has a tantrum, and they think that colleague is a jerk. And that's why, or they're nuts, they're a whack job. That's why they're having a tantrum. Out the window goes the circumstantial view. But relevant to those we work with. So as I go along here, I want to talk about the old ideas and make a case for this new idea. That's the central principle of my talk. I didn't title my talk very well. I probably should have focused on this idea rather than EIBI, ASD, and behavior analysis, but it all knits together. One place where we do use the idea is when we're evaluating our own behavior. When our behavior is a bit of a problem for others, we tend to account for ourselves in terms of circumstances. And the reason for that is we're somewhat aware of our circumstances and our history, so we can account for ourselves that way. When somebody else in our life is a problem, we don't use the idea because we're not aware of their circumstances. We don't know their history, so we call upon the old ideas I'm going to discuss to understand, know, and approach their behavior. Let me give you some examples. First of all, I'm talking here about the fundamental attribution error. That's fundamentally what it is. It's the tendency to attribute the source of one's own behavior when it's a problem to their our circumstances, and to attribute the source of the other person's problem to something about them. So the reason that I didn't return the phone call is because I was buried in work. And the reason that you didn't return the phone call is because you're irresponsible. The reason I was late to the meeting is because I got caught in traffic, and the reason that you were late to the meeting is because you're lazy and irresponsible. The reason that I threw a tantrum is because my cell phone broke down right in the middle of a business call and I couldn't complete it. And the reason that you threw a tantrum is because you're just an angry and mean person. The reason I got a bad grade in the test is because my roommates were up all night. I didn't get a chance to study. The reason you got a bad grade in the test is because you're stupid. The typical interpretation of the other person is that there's something wrong with them. And this something wrong with them, this way we account for their behavior, comes in three primary flavors. Here they are. I'll talk about each one. The first is there's something wrong with them in their morality. They have a defective morality. That's why they are a problem. That's why they're exhibiting the problem behavior. They're evil, bad, wrong, awful, unscrupulous, unconscionable. They lack a conscience. They don't know right from wrong. They're in league with the devil. They're inhabited by the devil. They are the devil. This is the Malleus Maleficarum. I don't know if you know what that is. That's the handbook used in the Middle Ages to identify witches. And in the Malleus Maleficarum are some descriptions of what we now know of as behavior disorders, although they didn't have the conceptual equipment back then that we have now, and so they thought of it as witchcraft. In fact, there's a very nice description of Tourette's syndrome in the Malleus Maleficarum, and they didn't have a way of understanding Tourette's syndrome back then, so they interpreted it in terms of a defect in morality, in other words, evil, in other words, witches. And the assessment process for witches was pretty rigorous. They threw the suspected witch into the middle of a deep pond, and if she drowned, she was innocent. If she survived, they burned her at the stake, so there's just no way of getting around this. Now imagine, if you will, this was the only idea we had to know, understand, and approach problem behavior exhibited by persons on the spectrum. This is the only idea we had. Think about what life would be like for them. I don't think it would be very pleasant. The second conceptual area, the second ancient idea is that the reason a person is exhibiting problem behavior is because they have a defect in their character or their personality. They're lazy, stubborn, stupid, mean, irresponsible, selfish, self-centered, myopic, narrow-minded, narcissistic, avaricious, greedy. I could go on here, but you get the idea. Now, imagine, again, what life would be like for persons on the spectrum if the only way we had to interpret their problem behavior was these two ideas. I don't think life would be very pleasant for them. Here's the third ancient idea. Psychopathology. The reason a person is exhibiting problem behavior is because they have a defect in their psyche, otherwise known as psychopathology. So they're mentally ill, they're insane, they're psychotic, they're lunatics, they're whack jobs. They've got OCD, they got ADHD, they got MOUSE, they got something that you can get out of a psychiatric manual. Now imagine, again, what life would be like for persons on the spectrum if the only ways we had to know, understand, and approach their problem behavior were these three ideas. And let me tell you the sad news. In fact, let me tell you the awful news. These are the only ideas the vast majority on the planet have for knowing, understanding, and approaching the problem behavior of anybody, including persons on the spectrum. They don't have access to the idea I'm promoting right now, or if they have access to it, they don't even accept it. So they use that equipment, and is it any wonder why the situation in the world is as bad as it is when you have this kind of thinking going on? There are a lot of downsides to using these ideas. For example, people don't like to be thought of as defective, flawed, or mentally ill. It doesn't promote amity or cooperation or partnership. It doesn't promote relationship. In fact, it seems to set the stage for defensiveness at a minimum, vindictiveness possibly, and sometimes retaliatory responses. these ideas don't lead to effective correctives. In other words, we're sort of powerless in the presence of defects. We don't know how to solve a defect in somebody's soul. We don't know how to solve a defect in somebody's character. We're not even very good at solving defects in somebody's psyche. And thirdly, viewing people as defective, flawed, or mentally ill leads to harsh judgment and treatment. And all that violence that's going on in the Middle East right now, that's done to stamp out evil. And I have to face this with my clients. I work with clients in Omaha, Nebraska, a lot of whom are well known in the community. And when they come to see me, they come in the back way. They don't want to be seen in the waiting room. Why? Because of the stigma that's associated with delivering that kind of care. It could be bad for their careers and their reputations. It's the sort of thinking that comes about from assuming somebody's mentally ill. Now, there's the new idea. Behavior is a function of circumstances, by and large, and it has a lot of success. Has a lot of mothers and fathers. B.F. Skinner, John Watson, people in this room, people that are responsible for the science known as behavior analysis. But its first very public communication came from Father Edward J. Flanagan, who founded Boys Town, where I work. At the time he started Boys Town in 1917, Omaha was overrun with orphaned boys, and they were pretty obnoxious. They were pickpockets and thieves. They were dirty and ragged. They were underfoot. They were loud. They were intrusive. And people in the community of Omaha thought they were bad boys. Father Flanagan said, there's no such thing as a bad boy. Only bad environment, bad teaching, and bad modeling. In other words, bad circumstances. And in saying so, he forwarded this idea, which we now have to know and understand and approach the problem behavior of other people, especially persons on the spectrum. And there are tremendous advantages to using this new idea. Number one, people, they welcome the circumstantial view of their problem behavior. Why? Because it's exactly how they interpret their own problem behavior. We interpret our own problem behavior in terms of our circumstances. If you're having an argument with your spouse, and he's saying or she's saying, you did this, you did that, you'll account for this or that in terms of your circumstances. But when it comes to saying something about what they did, you won't use the circumstances because that would seem to justify the problem. And so you use some kind of one of those old ideas, maybe two or three of the old ideas. Plus, circumstances can be modified in ways that improve the problem behavior. That's what the next 4 days is all about. That's what this conference is all about. You can go from room to room to room for the next 4 days, and there will be a person or person standing at the front of that room, and they will be talking about how to rearrange circumstances to bring about socially adaptive improvements in behavior or something along those lines. That's what we're doing here. And then the circumstantial view does not justify harsh judgment and treatment. Quite the contrary. It promotes understanding, sometimes compassion, and a willingness to help. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're late for work, you come up to a very busy intersection, there's only one car at the light, you come up behind it, and you feel lucky because there's only one car there, and you wait for a while, and then the light turns green, but the car in front of you doesn't budge, just sits there. Now you're a little, exasperated, I suppose, and you look up there and you see there's a woman in the driver's seat, but she's not looking out the window. She's messing around in the back seat of her car doing something, completely oblivious to the fact that the light is green and that you're late for work. And then the light turns yellow and red, and you sit there, and you sit there, and you sit there, and it turns green again. You're ready to go, and the car still doesn't budge. And now you take another look up there, and you see she's still messing around in the back seat, and this is infuriating. You lay on the horn, she takes no notice of you, and it still stays there, and the light turns yellow and red again, and that's it, and that's it is probably it, if you're me. And I might walk up to that car, and let's say I look inside, and I see that in the back seat is a baby, and the baby is turning blue, and that's why she is attending to the back seat. That's why that car is stationary. Now you understand fully the circumstances that have led to this exasperating event, but out the window goes the exasperation, and in the window comes understanding, compassion, a willingness to help. Now here's the point. Here's the central point. There's always a baby in the back seat. There's always a baby in the back seat. Not as dramatic as the one I just sketched. I did that for rhetorical effect. But there's always a set of circumstances that is functionally tied to the problem behavior. The science of behavior analysis is committed to demonstrating that's the case, and they have tools that are designed to find those circumstances. Functional analysis and functional assessment, that's RMRI. And those are founded on the principle that there's always a baby in the back seat. So let me talk a little bit about the clinical power of the circumstantial view and start with how it was used to empty out human warehouses through three forces: normalization, circumstantial programs, and deinstitutionalization. And that picture there is from Boulder River School and Hospital in Boulder, Montana, where I had my first professional job. I learned last week that Boulder River School and Hospital will be closed forever at the end of this year. It's the last, or one of the last of its kind. These institutions have been closing down since the mid-70s, and the reason for that is because of these three forces, which are fundamentally founded on the circumstantial view. Originally, people would go into the institutions, and they'd see people living there, persons with developmental disabilities, and those persons would be engaging in what we now know of as institutional behavior. And so they'd see the institutional behavior, and they'd think to themselves, that's why they belong in the institution, because they're engaging in institutional behavior. But through the philosophy of normalization came the opinion that, wait a minute, the reason they're engaging in institutional behavior is because the institution is a set of circumstances that brings about institutional behavior. And if we take them out of the institution and put them into a normal environment, they'll be in a normal set of circumstances which will bring about normal behavior, which in fact has happened across the land. And people are being brought out of those institutions and put into normal circumstances, and their behavior has become normalized, and now they flourish in those communities and work with people like you. Unfortunately, in the beginning, some of the folks that were there, many of the folks that were there, most of the folks that were there had been there so long that they've developed serious deficits in adaptive behavior and serious surpluses in maladaptive behavior. So the institutions and the states hired an army of circumstantial specialists, otherwise known as master's level behavior analysts, who went into these institutions and developed programs to increase adaptive behavior, decrease maladaptive behavior. Out the institution, the folks that were there went. And the first wave of people to go out of the institutions were people with epilepsy. What were they doing there? Well, they used to interpret epilepsy in light of those old ideas and thought it was a form of mental illness and put them in institutions. But since many or most of them were typically developing cognitively, they learned fast. And so they developed a lot of adaptive behavior, shed a lot of maladaptive behavior, and out of the institutions they went into the community settings where they've been flourishing for many years. The next wave of folks that came out of the institutions were persons on the spectrum. Why? Why would they go next? There's a couple of reasons. One is, and I'm going to engage in what I guess I got to call it syndromism. It's syndromism, it has to be. It's like sexism and racism, only it's syndromism. It's like some syndromes are better than other syndromes. I'm not saying that some syndromes are better than other syndromes. I'm saying syndromism would posit that some syndromes are better than other syndromes. And I'm saying the reason that persons on the spectrum went out next is because of syndromism. There was an appealing syndrome. There was something mystical about children. There was something appealing about the story, that they were normal for a while and then not normal anymore. There was a certain light that some people thought they gave off. There was something attractive about kids that had that problem. And the second reason is many of them, as we now know, were typically developing in terms of cognitive skills, and so they learned fast. And they developed the adaptive behaviors, shed the maladaptive behaviors, and out of the institutions they went, and now they're in the community settings, and they're working for people or with people just like you and flourishing in those settings. Let me go a little further with the clinical power of the idea, talking about some other areas where it's been applied. See, everywhere it's been applied, everywhere where this idea has been energetically applied, fundamentally miracles have been produced. So let's start with autism. I mentioned that already. Autism has benefited, or persons on the spectrum have benefited from the deinstitutional movement, which was founded on the circumstantial view, but there's also EIBI, which was fundamentally introduced by Ivar Lovaas in the late 80s, when he showed that if you apply this treatment early enough and intensively enough, that you could, in some cases, eliminate the symptoms of the syndrome. Now, I hesitate to use the word cure, but when you eliminate the symptoms of a condition, it seems like the word cure fits. But this was a genetically transmitted, historically thought of as incurable disease or syndrome, and now we have something akin to cure going on, and dramatic reduction in symptoms for those that aren't cured. This is an EIBI is a treatment based on the circumstantial view of behavior. Let's go to habit disorders, and there are many of them. We'll start on the benign end with thumb sucking and fingernail biting, and all the way up to the granddaddy of all habit disorders, Tourette's syndrome. Let's start with there. Tourette's syndrome is a genetically transmitted neurological disease, the hallmarks of which are chronic vocal and motor tics. And there is no known cure, at least there has not been, and there is no role for psychology, whether it's behavioral or clinical. At least that has historically been the case. In fact, the neurologists have energetically chased away psychology for decades because they think they make the situation worse rather than better. That was true until Nate Azrin came along and developed a circumstantially based program called habit reversal, and he showed that using it intensively could dramatically reduce the symptoms of this neurological condition called Tourette's syndrome. And then along came a small group of researchers all deriving what they were doing from Nate Azrin's work. They're working now in a nationally interconnected grant-funded program, and what they're showing is if you get to Tourette's syndrome early enough and apply habit reversal intensely enough, you can eliminate the symptoms of the condition. I hesitate to use the word cure, but if you eliminate the symptoms of a condition, it seems like the word cure would fit. Let's go on down to incontinence. Incontinence is the #2 cause of child abuse. Incontinence is the #2 cause of child abuse. Now, why is that? You know, any of its forms, delayed toilet training, functional fecal incontinence, diurnal enuresis, nocturnal enuresis, why would it be a cause of child abuse? Because people often interpret incontinence in light of those old ideas, particularly in the area of character. The child is incontinent because they're lazy or stubborn, and that seems to justify harsh treatment, which sometimes lead to child abuse. And now what we have is a circumstantially based batch of programs that can produce an 80 to 100% cure rate across all forms of incontinence if applied consistently enough. What about anxiety? Anxiety is the #1 psychiatric disorder affecting mankind round the globe. And the most effective treatment by far for all the 12 anxiety disorders is a circumstantially derived program that is basically escape extinction. It has other terms like exposure and response prevention, systematic desensitization, but they all really are just escape extinction, another circumstantially derived program. What about depression? Depression is the #2 psychiatric disorder affecting mankind around the globe, and the most effective treatment, favorably compared to medications, the most effective treatment is a circumstantially derived program called behavioral activation, and it has a multi-component version called acceptance and commitment therapy. And then what about addiction? The #1 behavior disorder affecting mankind around the globe, and the most effective treatments for addictions, whether they involve nicotine or heroin or everything in between, is a circumstantially derived set of programs that involve contingency management. So that's, I think, compelling evidence for the clinical power of the idea. Let me talk a little bit about its breadth. The reason I want to talk about its breadth, the reason I feel compelled to do so, is because there's a widespread notion in this country and around the world that the circumstantial view of behavior is very narrow in scope, and it's only relevant for very simple forms of behavior, most typically exhibited by rats and pigeons or persons with serious disabilities. I first became acquainted with this notion when I was in graduate school. I was in a PhD-level behavioral psychology program at the University of Kansas. That was a program founded on the circumstantial view of behavior. That was in the daytime. At night, I was in a PhD-level clinical program, and that program was founded on the old ideas, most notably psychopathology. I did that because I wanted to get licensed as a psychologist when I got all done. The people in the clinical psychology program, I got to know them and I got to know what they thought, talked about the people in the behavioral psychology program and referred to them as the push-pull, click-click people, because they believed that behavioral psychology in all of its forms, for example, behavior analysis or applied behavior analysis, was really very narrow in scope, only relevant for very simple forms of behavior such as pushing and pulling and clicking, and only pertinent for rats and pigeons and persons with serious disabilities. And for all the other stuff, much more sophisticated approaches to knowing, understanding, and approaching human behavior were needed, such as those derived from the old ideas I discussed initially. So I feel compelled to talk about its breadth, and to do so I picked an experience that all humans have sometimes, and some humans have a lot of times: pain and suffering. And I picked it for other reasons too. Number one, I picked it because to demonstrate breadth. Number two, I picked it because persons on the spectrum have more pain and suffering in their lives than typically developing persons, probably because they find so much of everyday life aversive until they benefit from the kinds of programs that you folks implement. And thirdly, I hope to some extent to equip you with some information you might be able to use as you approach people in your life who have pain and suffering. So to get the ball rolling, I want to start by talking about pain. There are two types: organic and functional. Organic pain is pain that's derived from the body. There's something wrong with the body. There's a contusion, an abrasion, a lesion, there's an inflammation, there's an infection, there's a heightened pressure or some abnormal cell development, things along those lines. And then functional pain is pain that is definitely pain, but there's no organic reason for it. There's no bodily-based reason for it. And the point I want to make is that using the circumstantially derived approach to pain and suffering, we can reduce some organic pain and eliminate all functional pain. Then let me use as my example a condition called recurrent abdominal pain. Recurrent abdominal pain is a pain syndrome that children have where they have chronic stomach aches, and they come to the attention of clinicians because they miss a lot of school. And so we studied these kids when I was at Johns Hopkins years ago. We found out two interesting things about them. Number one, there wasn't anything wrong with them. There was nothing wrong with their body. There was no organic basis for their pain. And number two, they were definitely in pain. All the hallmarks of pain were present. They had elevated blood pressure, elevated heart rate, elevated galvanic skin response, elevated cortisol levels in their saliva. Their pupils were constricted. Sometimes they had pallor, they had sweating. They were clearly in pain. Now, how's that possible? How's it possible to have all that pain and not have any reason for it in the body? Well, it turns out there's some pain behaviors, and it altered my way of thinking about pain and suffering. I want to try and alter yours just a little. That pain is partly something that you have and also something that you do. There are pain behaviors, and one of the significant ones is focus. Like these kids with recurrent abdominal pain were inordinately focused on their bodies and inordinately focused on their abdomens. And so anything that they noticed that was out of the ordinary was brought into full view and got magnified by that focus. Let me just use a couple of everyday examples to sketch out what I mean. I'll use running a marathon. I presume there's at least some people in this room that have run a marathon. And in the middle of the marathon, when the person's halfway, that's where suffering and pain is the greatest. The person's muscles have been taxed, their energy stores are depleted, they're dehydrated, they're sweaty and hot, and they're full of mental anguish about whether they can make it all the way. They're taxing themselves with the idiocy of their decision to do it in the first place. They're looking around to see if they can get out of this thing with dignity somehow. They are in pain, and they are suffering. Let's fast forward now to 200 yards from the finish line. At that point, their body's in far worse shape. They're way more dehydrated, their muscles are more taxed, their energy stores are more depleted, they're sweatier, they're hotter, and they're more out of breath. And there is no pain and there is no suffering. In fact, they're exhilarated. And they're probably as exhilarated as they'll be at any point in their life. Now, why? Why, when they're in way worse shape bodily, is there less pain and suffering than in the middle where they're in better shape bodily? It's all focus. At the end of the race, they're focused on the finish line. They're focused on the crowd, the cheering crowd. They're focused on the water they're going to drink. They're focused on the sense of accomplishment. In the middle, the person is focused on their body, how bad it hurts, how far they have to go, and whether they're going to make it. So pain and suffering is magnified, not because of some organic condition, but because of some functional condition. And that functional condition is brought on by focus. The second thing is after the person focuses, these children focus on their abdomen, then they would express the pain. And it comes in two forms, direct and indirect. The indirect expression is just the signs of pain on the face, the change in breathing, the wincing, the difference in walking, and then the direct is just the complaints of pain. These expressions would then make contact with environmental or circumstantial response to pain. It activated the circumstances surrounding them, and it produced, especially in the parents of these kids on this with recurrent abdominal pain, a batch of behaviors, one of which was hovering. The parents would hover a lot, and in hovering, they would ask the child a lot about how they were doing. And in so doing, they are directing the child's focus onto their abdomen and onto their pain and onto their situation. So even if the child wasn't paying any attention to their body, they're just watching cartoons, mom or dad could come in and very, very caringly ask how they were doing, and all of a sudden they're focused down on their stomach and they're not doing too well. That would lead to, let's call this a verbal commodity whose function is the reduction of pain and whose side effect is the production of pleasure, and I'm calling that sympathy. Because sympathy is a verbal analgesic. That's its purpose. It's an attempt by us to use verbal behavior to reduce the pain and suffering of another person. And it has a byproduct. It often delivers pleasure at the same time. Any commodity that has pleasure production and pain reduction functions is highly habit-forming. Any commodity that has pleasure production and pain reduction functions is highly habit-forming. I'll just name a few. Percodan, Percocet, Dilaudid, Demerol, Vicodin, morphine. Are these good things? Absolutely. Absolutely. Anybody in the audience that's had an operation or a major pain in their life knows these are good commodities. But they're only given in small amounts, and they're only given a short period of time. Why? Because physicians know how habit-forming they are, and if they give too much, they know that the person they gave too much to will begin to behave in ways whose specific function or purpose is to get more of the stuff. And the same appears to be true with sympathy, and it looked like it was true with these kids, that they were kind of hooked on sympathy, if you will. Parents were kind of hooked on care and compassion in the form of hovering. The kids become hooked on sympathy that the parents deliver. But what I want to take aim at here is a notion that could form, which I would call intentionality. The kids are intentionally trying to get the sympathy. And I'm not sure that's the case. A lot of our behavior is more automatic than that. I'll give you an example from my own life. And the example is designed to communicate the power of sympathy and the automatic nature of the operant responses that it can functionally be related to. So in this example, I'm 8 years old. I'm in Montana. I'm from Montana, land where men are men, and so are the women. It's a rough country, rugged country, and very, very cold in the wintertime. Not Pennsylvania cold, Montana cold. And this is a very cold day. It's below zero. I'm ice skating in an ice skating pond 2 blocks from my house. It's getting dark, so I go to the side of the pond. I take off my skates. My hands are freezing, and they're shaking a little, and I cut my finger on my ice skate. And that hurts. My hands hurt, my finger hurts, but something very, very cool for an 8-year-old boy begins to happen. The blood begins to freeze into a blood sickle. I'm totally captivated by this blood sickle. And so I've forgotten about the pain in my hands. I've forgotten about the pain in my finger. And I hatch a plan. My plan is to walk very carefully home, let the blood sickle get bigger, go into the house, find my 7-year-old brother, show it to him, and then wipe it on his face. And then he and I will pretend like we had a fight. This is like Montana boys having fun with no money. So that's the plan. And I'm completely into the plan, walking carefully home until I get to the top step of the porch of our house. I look in the window, and my mom is there sitting under a reading lamp knitting. And as soon as I saw her, the pain returned to my hand and my finger, and I turned upside down, and I walked over and I said, look what I did to my finger. Now, here's the point I'm trying to make. I did not do that. I didn't hatch that plan. That did itself. I had a plan in my head, and I was into the plan. And to this day, I can still hear my voice in the back of my head as I was doing this thing with my mother, and it was, what are you doing? What about the plan? I couldn't help myself. I mean, I literally couldn't help myself. And that's what I'm trying to suggest is some of this behavior isn't purposeful, intentional, with malice and aforethought. It's like automatic, and it's activated by very, very powerful consequences. Sympathy is a powerful consequence. Am I trying to suggest that people shouldn't hover? No. Am I trying to suggest you shouldn't sympathize? No. Just like I wouldn't say never ever use Percodan. Just I want to acquaint people with the power of this stuff so you know what you're using. And then that led to special treatment for these kids. They got special treatment. They didn't have to go to school. They didn't have to do their homework. They didn't have to do their chores. Their siblings were forbidden to torment them or tease them in any way. They got to make up a bed on the couch, watch cartoons all day, color all day. They got a special diet. People talk to them in a special tone of voice. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. It's just that how did they get all this special treatment? They got all this special treatment by being in pain and by expressing their pain, activating the whole chain of events. Were they faking it? Were they faking it? This is going to sound counterintuitive, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they were faking it, because even if they're faking it and that faked behavior gets caught up in that powerful set of circumstances, it can become very real. Remember, these kids have stomach aches that are not in any way tied to something in the body. This is all functional pain. Real pain, but functional. So let me give an example of how, I don't know, how even faking it can still trap a kid. I'm going to use as my example the Mental Health Day. Some of you know what I'm talking about. I know I'm not the only one in this room that ever took a mental health day. A mental health day is the day you take off work, but you don't call up work and complain about your mental health. You call up work and complain about your physical health so you can take a day off for your mental health. But you can't call up full of vim and vigor. You can't call up very excited about your plan. You can't call up enthused about the strategy that you're going to employ for the day. You got to be sick. You got to call up sick. So it's like, oh, wow, man. Oh, yeah, no, I've been up all night. I don't know, man. Some kind of a bug. I don't know. It's a gut thing. Oh, yeah, I drank a lot of fluids. I can't keep them down. No, man, you don't need to call. No, I'll be in tomorrow. Yeah, okay, thanks. See you later. Oh, man. Oh, I gotta go to bed, jeez. Wait a minute. I'm not sick. You gotta snap out of it. You know, you get into the role. You're like sick. You walk around, oh, man, there's nobody watching. It's just you and your cat. See, when method actors that use the Stanislavski, I'm saying that right? Never mind. Method actors, when method actors engage in an emotional scene for a movie, and the scene is over, they don't snap out of it right away. Sometimes it takes all day for them to get out of the mood that they brought forth in order for that scene to have some resonance. It's like they're experiencing the very emotion that they're conveying for the movie. It's in some way real. And that's, I think, what, even if the kids fake it, that's what they do, is they get into the sick role. In short, they make themselves kind of sick, and then we come along and water and fertilize what they just made up, and it becomes real. So, again, am I saying they shouldn't get special treatment? No, I'm not saying that. Am I blaming the victim? I hope it doesn't sound like that. I'm just saying we're dealing with powerful stuff here. Those old ideas, they're useful. They're easy to use. They're widely applicable, but they're not very powerful. This idea, the circumstantial view, is really powerful, and everything it touches changes. And when we deliberately touch stuff with it, it changes for the better. But when we accidentally touch stuff with it, it can go either way. And sometimes with pain and suffering, that's the case. So I hope I've argued for the breadth of the idea, the clinical power of the idea. I've talked about the ideas with which it's in competition. Let me back all the way out of this and conclude. There's no such thing as a bad boy. There's no such thing as a bad boy. There is no such thing as a bad boy, but there are good people. There are good people. I'm looking at a room full of them. I'm looking at a room full of good people. I'm looking at a room full of chosen people, because you are the chosen people. So chosen by whom? Well, you weren't chosen by anybody. You were chosen by the circumstances of your life, to devote a portion of your life, and for some of you a very large portion, to people less fortunate than yourselves. And to the extent that you do so, you have a real shot at happiness and satisfaction in your life, because that is the formula. That is the pathway. Self-focus is not the pathway. Looking out for number one is not the pathway. Looking out for others, having something else in mind, something else that you focus your life on, especially if it's somebody less fortunate than yourself, is the pathway to happiness and satisfaction and a good life. The greatest members of our species have shown us this is the way. Jesus Christ showed us the way. Mahatma Gandhi showed us the way. Martin Luther King showed us the way. Mother Teresa showed us the way. Father Flanagan showed us the way. These are the embodiments of everything that's great about human beings. And what they showed us is get your attention off yourself and onto people or something other than yourself, especially people less fortunate than yourself. And to the extent that you are doing so, well, you're doing the Lord's work, whatever you conceive him to be. And secondly, you've been chosen. You've been chosen by the circumstances of your life to receive the circumstantial view of behavior into your life, so as you do this work, you do it more effectively. So you've been chosen to do the Lord's work and do it well. That's my point. For this I thank you, and I thank you for all the people that you have helped and that will help in the course of your lifetimes. And I also thank you for letting me be part of your circumstances today. It's been an honor and a privilege. Thank you very much.
Pat Friman, thank you. Okay, what we do matters. Okay, the code. BIP. That's BIP. 543. BIP 543. Thank you, and our next speaker will be up in just a minute. We'll take about a 5-minute break again, just a real quick break.